Before the closing remarks, I have the pleasure to be the chair for this keynote speech in honor of Anthony de Rugy, who passed away this year in January. Let me say a few words on him. De Rugy was a libertarian. He has a huge work that should be studied in this 21st century. His most important book, The State, is written in the public choice tradition. His book develops a dynamic theory of why government cannot remain limited and is, by its very nature, destined to expand. In these short remarks, I want to address one academic suggestion he offers several times. He said, a first step to an adequate understanding of the state is to think about an environment without one. The organizers of the conference have selected the best research fellow to honor de Rugy. Veronique de Rugy received her MA in economics from the Paris Daphne University and her PhD in economics from the Pantheon-Sorbonne University. Then she moved to the United States, where she became resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a policy analyst at the Cato Institute, a research fellow at the Atlas Economic Research Foundation, and the Mercatus Center. So please welcome Veronique with a long hand applause.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I don't know, do I have a PowerPoint or not? If I don't, it's great because I'm completely technically challenged. So I would actually rather not have to think about my brain and my hands at the same time. No PowerPoint? Great. So it's a pleasure to be here. It's certainly an honor to be talking at this session in honor of Anthony de Rugy. I can only wish I'd be, 10% as good as he was. Awesome. And it's also an honor to be here in Vienna. I haven't been here in a long time, and it's kind of intimidating to be talking like I will about Austrian economics and Don Lavoie in front of actual, real Austrian. I also want to thank you for being here right now, as I recognize that being the last session of this conference on a Friday, I'm the only thing between you and a drink. So I'm going to try to go fast. What I want to talk to you today about is something that has actually been really greatly disconcerting to me in recent years in the US. There's a very real resurgence of the concept of industrial policy. Benjamin Franklin was said to have said that the only thing constant in life are death and taxes. And I would actually say that the truth of the matter is that he should have added also bad economic ideas. The ones that we thought we had defeated and forever, and then they keep coming back. Of course, they shift. The way the argument is made is shifting around. But nonetheless, these ideas are coming up again. So industrial policy is one of these. And I'm in this weird position because while I work at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, while I am among a lot of economists in an econ department and a law school that are academics, most of my work is grounded in policy. That's what I do. Mercatus is a place where we actually are a bridge between the academic world and the policy world. But in a lot of ways, most of what I do is fight the bad policy ideas that come up. And I was telling Bob on the phone before I came here, said, in a lot of time, I realize I've lost my academic brain, and I think like a policy person. And what policy people do is that they actually, even the libertarians who are highly rooted in academic thinking and Austrian thinking, we tend to actually just address the argument as it comes, from the empirical side, as opposed to do what these guys were talking about. You start with a theory, and then you do. So on industrial policy, this is a typical example where I started this fight, right, addressing these issues from an empirical perspective, and I'm going to mention some of these arguments. And then one day, I came across, not so long ago, and I'm embarrassed to say, like it was back in March, I read finally the work of Don Lavoie, which basically has taken all of these ideas that we have heard of here in this conference and were born here in Vienna, in Austria, to seal the case in theory against industrial policy. So let's start. There are like two main arguments right now for the resurgence of industrial policy, and it blows my mind that they actually are using the words, we need an industrial policy, right? Because they used to be a big no-no, you would never say this, at least in the US the last 20 years. And those two arguments are, first, we need an industrial policy in the US in order to defeat China 2025 plan and its desire to dominate globally. The next part of this argument is that basically, look, China has been extremely successful with its industrial policy, and so were, the Asian countries, what we call the Asian miracle, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, and all these countries that grew so fast, and it is because we are told, because they implemented in the 60s and so on, very important industrial policy. The second big argument that you hear, so that's the first one, that the Asian miracle type of argument. The second one is that, the market really actually doesn't allocate resources properly at the domestic level. It may do it at the global level in theory, but at the domestic level, they don't, and then they don't protect some vital sectors. And in particular, people point to the decline in manufacturing employment, which I'm sure resonate here because this is a phenomenon that's been happening everywhere in the world, in most industrial countries. So the decline in manufacturing employment, whether in as a share of the economy or in absolute term, is seen as a danger brought about by other countries' competition and hence require an industrial policy. So these are the two first things. And as I was actually writing this talk, I was actually thinking, what is the difference between big government takeover of the economy and industrial policy? Because ultimately, in my opinion, the takeover of healthcare, for instance, right, whether it is completely taking it over and have nationalized healthcare or have high level of regulations and subsidies or price controls and things like this. I mean, this effectively is industrial policy at the domestic level. So what is actually the difference? And I think that in the way people think about industrial policy when they use actually this word, what they mean is like they think about it as a mean to implement hand-to-hand combat between governments around the world competing with one another. And they really believe that, in a sense, growth and employment are conditional on this ability for a country led by its government policy to actually succeed. And in fact, President Trump just made a speech in New York talking about how the US had to be like the most competitive. And by the way, this is an area, this notion of country competing against another and the fact that it was actually kind of a complete economic fallacy. Paul Krugman used to be really good on that, by the way. More later, we can talk about this during the Q&A. So I think that's the big difference between industrial policy. So in my work, the way I've been actually fighting these arguments, right, whether through papers and articles on TV, Twitter, however you, is actually to do the reverse of what Tom and Bob said we should be doing. And they're right. Fundamentally, I just completely embraced their method. I should have gone, the theory, and then you go to the empirical evidence. But the empirical evidence is actually quite clear, right? The Asian miracle stuff, there is so much literature to show that, yes, in fact, these countries, whether it's South Korea, Japan, and for one thing, Hong Kong never actually implemented industrial policies ever, and even to this day, their protectionism is really effectively non-existent. Singapore, it was always very light at the beginning, but for the most part, same story as Hong Kong. So really, these cannot be used as cases of country that grow fast thanks to government intervention. But South Korea, Taiwan, Japan protected its nascent car industry after the Second World War for decades, right? This is shown to be said these countries grew because precisely the government protected them against competition from abroad. And what even the World Bank, which is not the bastion of libertarian thinking, actually even in the 90s and 2000 actually had reports saying, well, wait a minute, actually it's really, this is correlation, not causation. And the truth of the matter about the growth of these countries is that the reason why they were growing, it's because they had implemented, first and foremost, like fundamental market reforms. They had the basic right. They had property rights. They had protection under the law. They had actually real, and in fact, when they had barriers, whether it was South Korea or Taiwan, it was going against the growth brought on by the private sector, or it was actually just kind of like quite ineffectual to the point that it was just not even worth mentioning. What about China? China is obviously one that people are using all the time. And I recommend a wonderful book by Nobel laureate Ronald Coase and economist Ning Wang called How China Became Capitalist. And basically, the book is published in 2012, and it documents actually how the growth in China is only explained to the extent that China has implemented these fundamental market reforms. And then I would actually recommend that you read a book by the Peterson Institute economist Nicholas Lardy that picks up where Coase and Wang leaves it, and they actually say, in 2012, here's the state of the world, 70% of the growth in China is the private sector growth. Right, and the growth for the last 30%, it's actually it's growing, but it's growing and eating up a lot of the private sector stuff. And they look at actually the scaling back for market reform ever since 2012 and the damage done through industrial policies that these policies have actually had and inflicted to economic growth. And it predicts, it says, if China continues this way, forget about growth, forget about progresses. So I think this case is well established. What about the manufacturing case and the disindustrialization of America? Well, so this case is actually one that just we fight all the time in the US, and it is true that there's a decrease in employment in manufacturing. But when you look at total output in real terms or in nominal term, it's at a near all-time high. When you look at industrial capacity, it's at an all-time high. When you look at all the factors that actually matter, you actually realize it at an all-time high. And while unemployment as a share of the economy and even in absolute terms has been going down, and this, by the way, really is true in all countries, what happens is it's not trade with other countries that have actually, yes, some of it is trade, but a vast majority, roughly on average, at the least, it's 80% of the job reduction that has happened in manufacturing have actually taken place because of productivity growth brought about by labor savings innovation. And the reason why most people or politicians are obsessed about manufacturing is because manufacturing jobs have relatively higher wages, right? But the reason why they have higher wages is because of the productivity growth that has actually reduced unemployment but made labor more productive and hence brought on higher wages. So these are a lot of the arguments that I make. And I have many, many, many more, because right now, that's pretty much all I do, thanks to Mr. Trump and its trade policy. We hear all these arguments for industrial policy and for protectionism, which often go hand in hand. But the thing that actually I found incredibly striking is like ultimately I'm wasting all this energy when the case against industrial policy has been made and sealed over 30 years ago with Don Lavoie. So in the height of the Cold War, economist Don Lavoie, who was at GMU when I came to GMU in 1999, actually. But I never actually really, I mean, I met him a few times, but I never actually completely realized how awesome he was. So at the height of the Cold War, Don Lavoie comes up with two books. One is called Rivalry and Central Planning, the Socialist Calculation Debate Revisited. The other one is called National Central Planning, What is Left. Both these books were published in 1985, so in the height of the Cold War. And Pete Boettke, who was a student of Don Lavoie, and I don't know how many of you know him, and who is a professor of economics, a permanent Austrian economist, and who is very colorful in his writing, he said, the publication of these two books were like a 1-2 punch, like a Michael Tyson kind of punch, boom, boom. Because the same year you have those two books that come up and arrive at the perfect moment. So first, the history, at the time the book was published, in the first book, Rivalry, was published, the notion that was out there was that Hayek and Mises had lost the calculation debate. And the reason for this, and it's stuff that we still suffer from today, is that market socialist economists, which I just can't wrap my head around what that even means, could prove mathematically that there was a series of prices that we could figure out would clear all markets, right? So that was the thing, like, look, you can do it on paper, it's possible, hence, we can do it. But the thing is that in 85, right, we have all these problems around the world with actually the actual implementation of socialism and communism is actually kind of not working. And those guys are like, but the model. And the real world is saying, well, obviously it's not working, right? So they're actually trying to figure out how they can refine their models, right, in order to actually make it work on paper. Enter Don Lavoie. Right? And with Rivalry and Central Planning, what he does is like, and by the way, the guy did his PhD, he was a former Marxist, and he did his PhD at MIT. He's not a complete, like, idiot in math, right? And he said, well, actually, Austrian economists, they don't deny at all the possibility that math can allow you to find these prices, right? Those prices that clear all market, they're a beautiful equilibrium, and you plug in the price and all this. What Austrians deny, however, and that is what the Rivalry book is about, is the fact that the discovery of these prices, these prices actually are, can actually be done by a real world central planner. So what he makes clear is that the Austrian case against central planning fundamentally rest on the understanding that those prices, right, that work to clear all market can only be discovered through the rivalry of market processes, right? The rivalry, this is why, I mean, this is the first word in the title. And the reason why is because, of course, this is obvious to most of us then, but it's because that information that is needed to be discovered and worked upon for the market to clear, right, is dispersed among not only millions of people, but millions and millions of decision makers, all of us, multiple times throughout the day, right? And it's also fleeting. So basically, no central planner can just accumulate that knowledge, keep it fresh every second, and actually spit out the price. And that seems maybe so obvious to us today, but at the time, we needed someone to re-explain really in a clear way what Mises and Hayek were saying. So that's rivalry. But then with central planning, national central planning, what is left, what he does, in the same year, right? It's published in the same year. Is like he says, oh, and by the way, let me explain it in terms that everyone can understand. And let me actually make one thing clear. Yes, the world right now is struggling with communism and socialism, the radical form. That can't work. But by the way, minor form of centralization can't work either. And it can't work either because precisely, and the two books come together beautifully, is because central planners systematically have to deal with the knowledge problem, this incapacity to actually gathering the information that leads to the discovery of prices. And by the way, I mean, it goes beyond just the discovery of the prices, but it's just we live in a dynamic economy, right? Let's even imagine that those central planners acquire, they guess right. They guess the right price. The thing is, like, as people consume and exchange, things change, right? And tastes change. But the central planner can't know that and make the adjustment on real time of, those prices so that the price is adjusted. So, like, even if the planner is lucky, even if you were to actually be able somehow mathematically to come up with the right formula, whatever, I'd rather use it to play the lottery, but it won't work. So the knowledge problem is just central planners can't overcome this. But there's another thing that Lavoie makes clear is that no matter what the form of planning, whether it's the radical, all-encompassing takeover of the economy, or whether it's actually just nationalization of small industries, or like the kind of run-of-the-mill kind of intervention to try to save an industry or a company, right? That creates a power problem. It's like no matter what form, it means people need to delegate power ultimately and put themselves under the control and the authority of the government, of the planner. So even whether that decision, the planner is made at the decentralized level of lower level of governments or actually the economy as a whole. And what he explains, and is really powerful, is like no matter what form of planning you have, you can't have freedom surviving with planning. Now, you can have some level, depending on the degree of planning. But for the most part, it requires giving up economic freedom. And one of the most fundamental things also that Lavoie explains is that this giving up this giving up of economic freedom, giving up economic freedom to an authority, but also the absence and the impossibility of actually acquiring that economic knowledge through planning means that the decisions are actually made politically. And political decisions, the way they're being allocated, effectively is the equivalent of militarism of the economy. It just basically leads to regulation and allocation, all done in the same way that mimic actually the way resources are allocated for national defense. And we may think that is worth it and maybe worthy there's a worthy cause for doing this for national security reason or whatever, to produce a military. There are debates. But inevitably, that type of organization of the economy is inefficient. And this is why, again, when I was talking with, so Boettke explained, and he said this militarism of the economy is why, instead of having the socialist utopia, right, of the left, of the socialists and communists, what you end up having is, the May Day parade of the Soviet Union that demonstrate their forces and power, because they need to enforce that power anyway to keep control over people. Like giving up freedom is actually, you may be willing to do it in times 0, but in practice, it requires quite an amount of resources to enforce. So, and what Lavoie does, and I think is incredibly enticing, at least for me, is like he makes a call for a radical agenda. He makes a call for us to make a radical commitment to markets. Because he explains the only way you can ever overcome the knowledge problem, and you can ever overcome the power problem, is by decentralization of power and decision-making at the individual level. And at the individual level of people who follows the rules, but also abide by property rights. Because these are the only way that you will actually produce the prices that clear the market and actually, have a functioning market system. The reason why Lavoie is so relevant today is because these arguments, I think, once you fundamentally understand Hayek and Mises' case about the impossibility of the socialist calculation, right? You start understanding, and I think Lavoie put it in so clear words that makes it impossible, and he actually looks at so many cases, right? That it makes it impossible to not understand that no matter what kind of government intervention you have, even the one you support, you can never actually make the case that these governments act in a way that can be efficient, for lack of a better word, right? That can actually truly work. And ultimately, you also have to accept that requires giving away some of the control, right? And this is true no matter what level of intervention. And in the debate against industrial policy, now, I actually try to start with this impossibility of overcoming the knowledge problem through those national state design policies that are supposed to actually coordinate the market better than markets themselves do. And I also think that it's enticing because fundamentally it's one message of peace and dignity, and that we should, this can only be, it seems to me, an argument, a winning argument. So I will try to do more and more what Tom and Bob aspire and do all the time, which is you start with a theory, you talk about Don Lavoie and Mises and Hayek, go for it if you're in a really geeky environment. And then you walk, if that is not enough, you walk your way through the empirical evidence that industrial policy has never worked, but also cannot work under any circumstances. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Veronique. We have 12 minutes for questions. Maybe a first question would be, what do you think about robotization and how this can change the employment in industry?
So trade and automation, right, are two areas that are highly perceived as a cause of complete disaster for the economy. And I'm actually not worried, because if you think about it, in the last 100 years, really, actually we've gone through so many automation phases. So for instance, think about the ATM, right? When the ATM came about, those things where you get the money from, it put out of business thousands and thousands and thousands of people who were being the one giving you your money before. But what it did basically is that that cost saving allowed banks to create even more banks. And so when you look at the number of banks that resulted, actually that followed the number of the automation of basically like the creation of ATMs, you realize that a lot of works were actually created, but also when you actually follow the people who were the one at the cashier giving the money, you see that they have moved on to higher level of services with higher pay. That story, I mean, we can show that it has actually existed and it reproduces itself over and over and over again. It's hard to actually see, like people are saying, well, right now the level of automation is much higher. But when you actually look at productivity rates, I mean, it's just hard to kind of see that this is a worry we should have. But I know this is something we're going to be like, talking about, and there are a lot of people proposing to do a lot of stupid things to actually avoid, automation, which, by the way, again, we've been living under for so many years.
I have two questions. Why did Don Lavoie speak of rivalry in his book instead of the usual word competition? All people speak of competition. Why does he use a rivalry? Is this a better word? Does he say different things or not?
Well,
and my
go ahead.
Second question is, naturally he is in favor of market, but market is not a market. There are markets with monopolies, or oligopolies and so on, and there are markets with anti-cartel laws. What does he say with regard to the anti-cartel laws?
Well, so the reason why I think, so Don Lavoie passed away in 2001, so I mean, it's not as if we can ask him, but the reason why he talks about rivalry is because it's this tension, this conflict, the friction that exists in the competitive market. It's that fundamental creative destruction that comes with competition that actually is rarely highlighted, that is really the drive. So it's the rivalry within competitive markets that he's pointing out that it's that struggle, like at a level. As for cartels, usually cartels are created and enforced in the long run by governments, so I suspect, he would tell you that this is why he talks about how, like, the only way to to overcome the knowledge problem and the power problem is to actually have decentralized decision makings at the level of individuals down. And those cartels often are created by government. The problem with anti-cartel law, and by the way, along with industrial policy, the antitrust laws are also making a comeback after we thought being defeated, is the fact that basically, ultimately, it is left to the non-omniscient power of government to actually establish what is an actual monopoly and what isn't. And it is also a story that we've heard over and over again, that a company is going to be having power forever and ever and ever going forward, and that actually never happens. So I suspect, but I'm not sure, obviously, that he would have issues with a lot of these antitrust laws. But I hate talking for someone, obviously. I have issues with antitrust law. How about that?
Thank you. I'm very deeply emotional about Don Lavoie, and I'm going to read his book. Just check it on Amazon, you can get it there. My question would be to you, or how would he argue with someone who says we're totally committed to free markets, free enterprise, end of industrial policy, even end of military things, but we cannot because our neighbors and our trade partners are so distorting the whole competitive scene, so we must do it as well.
So again, I really certainly cannot. I am not, apart from having read those two books and kind of, he has blown my world, which is why I actually wanted to talk about this today. I would would not claim I'm a Don Lavoie scholar, right? Because the extent, so I will tell you what I would say, right, about these issues, like two wrongs don't make a right. I mean, these countries distorted their market with their industrial policies, their subsidies, but scarcity is rare. In Russia, it's rare. I mean, their scarcity exists everywhere, even in China. And basically what you end up doing if you over-subsidize still, like it's the case, right? Basically you distort the resources and you divert them, you shift them towards the subsidized industry at the expense of the rest. So it is actually proven quite well that actually the people who share the biggest burden of those industrialist policy in China, for instance, are actually the Chinese themselves. Now, what can we do? Because it is true that when they flood the market, they create actual distortions. What do we do? Well, so first there are two things. Very often when we make these arguments, people only look at the competition with producers. But there's actually a benefit to consumers. You know, we tend to talk, and politicians tend to talk exclusively about producers. Producers are those that matter. But the actual benefit of trade, even highly subsidized trade or fair trade, however you want to call it, I mean, it's tremendous and unquestionable for consumers, right? The other thing that's pretty obvious is like the only industry, and it's actually quite hard to take down an industry or a company that is not, that is strong, right? And what competition does, and it's always done this, and competition is not for the faint of heart. It's like it takes down the weak. Now, you can lament this and say, well, if it hadn't been for China subsidizing, it would have happened ultimately, but not as fast, for sure. Now, what do you do about this? Well, you certainly don't mimic them and become more like them by putting in place non-market policies or tariffs or things like this. Because again, two wrongs don't make a right. The best way, I'd say, is multilateral agreements with our partners. Joining forces to actually change China's way, right? Using the WTO. Exactly the opposite of what the US is doing right now.
Thank you for your talk. It was very illuminating. Okay, so given that, you know, Ricardo and Smith pretty much did in the arguments for protectionism 250 years ago, why do you think these keep on returning to their feet like zombies coming to eat our brains? Do you think these policymakers really believe that protectionism is good, or are they just motivated in their reasoning by looking after their campaign contributors or catering to the electorate? What are your views on why these fallacies are still so successful?
Well, so I think it's an excellent question, and one that I struggle with a fair amount, because to be honest, I just didn't see the resurgence of protectionism at this level coming. I thought we had won. I mean, like 4 years ago, it was like going around with a talk about how we've won the battle of ideas. And trade war is my big example. So I really didn't see that coming. But I think that economic fallacies are like, I mean, they're easy. It's just kind of say, oh, well, look, you know, producers are like those companies. They have a hard time competing without ever looking at consumers. Oh, it's easier to understand that exports are great, but to actually say, oh, imports are bad, when in fact it's exactly the reverse. It's because true economic, you know, is actually just kind of counterintuitive. I can tell you, I don't want to actually assess people's motives, and yes, there are people who know they're doing the wrong thing or actually pushing the wrong ideas, and they know it's not, but I don't know that it is a majority of people. I can tell you President Trump truly believes this. It's like, this is the one thing he's actually been consistent over the last 30 years. And unfortunately, he's found the one economist, Peter Navarro, who's actually believed the same idiocy. And he's willing to, now Navarro's been paid, by the steel industry forever, and you can make that case, but, I don't know. I think it really boils down to the fact that they're just like economic thinking and being willing. Frédéric Bastiat, and I was kind of surprised that yesterday I heard that Bastiat was not liked by some Austrian. I love Bastiat. But he actually has a great quote where he said, the difference between a good and a bad economist is that the bad economist stops at what is seen. Right? The good economist is the one that goes beyond and look at the unseen. And that's what economists should do, right? And most people don't. And that's just, and it's frustrating. And I can tell you, it is pretty obvious that we have to refight these battle of ideas that we thought we had won, and maybe we became lazy and we forgot. And there's another thing, and I'm sorry I'm going on too long, but I think that one of the problems with free trade, one of the weakness of the case we've made is like we've actually used those multilateral agreements, right, as our way to promote free trade. Don't get me wrong, I love them, but fundamentally, at the heart of these agreements is a mercantilist argument. And it's one that basically says, we will agree to let your import in, even though we hate it, if you let us export, which we love. And fundamentally, it totally misunderstands that export's the cost and the true value of trade is import, right? So it's been a great ways to liberalize trade, but it's fundamentally the thinking behind it is protectionist. One more question, or one? There.
Building on that point, I'd just like to say how strange it is that free trade agreements run into thousands of word pages.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I've been perplexed by the way that free trade agreements run to thousands of pages. It's a little bit like the EU, which was supposed to deregulate the movement of people and goods. Simple, you deregulate. Next thing, the EU is a bureaucratic octopus.
Yeah.
So it's the same, it's like these thousands of pages of free trade agreements.
Yeah, it's managed trade. It's not free trade. Free trade, trade, the benefit of trade, economists know this since Adam Smith, right, is fundamentally unilateral. And what it means is like we will benefit and lowering all of our tariffs, all of our trade barriers, independently of what other countries are doing. So a real free trade agreement is like what Hong Kong has done, is that you go ahead, screw your consumers, we're going to actually lower our barriers and have no tariffs for the most part. Now, Hong Kong has other problems, And so that would be the free trade agreement. And by the way, Krugman, I've been reading a lot of Krugman, and one of the things that's fascinating, he has an article. It's a short article. It is actually really easy to read. I would recommend it. It's called "What Should Trade Negotiator Negotiate?" And what is amazing about this article, first it's great, and he was a Keynesian always, but he was kind of a light Keynesian, right? And one of the things that he's talking about is like, is there a place in free trade agreements for the negotiation of stuff such as labor requirements and environmental requirement? And pretty much he says, nah. No, because fundamentally, the benefit of free trade is unilateral. What you should go in there and do is actually say all the stuff you're gonna cut. If you can get the others to, copy, emulate what you're doing, it's great. But now, I'm sure he's totally in favor of the USMCA. The replacement for NAFTA it has like terrible work requirements and source requirement, and I'm sure he thinks it's like awesome. But anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you, Veronique.